The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
This poem is called The Squad of One. It's written by an Alberta poet by the name of Robert J.C. Stead, probably a little over 100 years ago. And he actually lived in the town of High River, where I happen to live right now. And so it's got a little bit of local culture to it. Probably based on fact, but a great story. Sergeant Blue of the Mounted Police was a so-so kind of guy. He lied a bit, and he swore a bit, and he boozed a bit on the sly. But he held the post at Snake Creek Bend in the good old British way, and a grateful country paid him about 60 cents a day. A life in the Northwest Mounted Police breeds an all-round kind of man, one who can finish whatever he starts, no matter how it began. A man who can wrestle a drunken bum or break up a range stampede. Such are the men of the Mounted Police, and such are the men they breed. Now the snow lay deep at the Snake Creek post and deep to the east and west. The sergeant had finished his 10-league beat and had settled down to rest in the 2x4 that they called a post, where the flag flew overhead. And he took a look at his monthly mail, and this is the note he read. To Sergeant Blue of the Mounted Police at the post at Snake Creek Bend, from the U.S. Sheriff of County Blank, greetings to you, my friend. There's a team of toughs that give us the slip, though they shot up a couple of blokes, and we reckon they's hid in Snake Creek Gulch and posing as farmer folks. Of all the toughs I ever saw, I reckon these the worst, so shoot to kill if you shoot at all, and be sure you do it first. And send out your strongest squad of men and bring them in if you can, for dead or alive. We want them here. Yours truly, Jack McMahon. The Sergeant Blue sat back and smiled, for his heart was glad and free, and he said, if I round these beggars up, it's another stripe for me, and promotion don't come easy to one of us Mountie chaps. So I'll scout around tomorrow and bring them in, perhaps. Next morning, Sergeant Blue, arrayed in farmer smock and jeans and a cutter sleigh he had made himself, set out for the evergreens that grow by the bank of Snake Creek Gulch, by a homestead shack he knew, and a smoke curled up from the chimney pipe to welcome Sergeant Blue. Aha, says Blue, and who are you? Behold, the chimney smokes, but the fellow that owns this homestead shack is up at Okotoks. And he wasn't expecting callers, for he left his key with me. So we'll just stop in for an interview, and we'll see what we shall see. So he drove his sleigh to the cabin door, and he hollered aloud, "G'day!" And a couple of men with fighting irons came out beside the sleigh. The sergeant said, I'm a stranger here, and I've driven a weary mile, and if you don't mind, I'll just sit down by the stove in the shack a while. So the sergeant sat and smoked and talked of the home he had left back east, of the snow and the cold and the price of land and the life for man and beast. And suddenly he broke it off with, "Neighbor, will you take a nip? There's a horn of the best you'll find out there in my jumper in the grip." So one of the two went out for it. And as soon as he closed the door, the sergeant tickled the other one's ribs with the nose of his .44. "Now, fella," he said, "you're a man of sense, and you know when you're on the rocks. and a noise as loud as a mouse from you, and they'll take you home in a box. So he fastened the bracelets to his wrist and his legs with a halter shank, and he took his knife and he took his gun and he made him as safe as the bank. And then he mustered up number 2 in an Indian file parade, and he gave some brief directions, and number 2 obeyed. He coupled them each to each and sat them down on the bed. "Ah, it's a frosty day, and we'd better eat before we go," he said. So he fried some pork, and he warmed some beans, and he set out the best that he saw, and he noted the price for the man of the house according to British law. That night at the post sat Sergeant Blue with paper and pen in hand, and this is the note he wrote and signed and mailed to a foreign land. "To the U.S. Sheriff of County Blank, greetings I send to you. My squad has just brought in your men," and the squad was Sergeant Blue. So while I ended up staying in the Regina City Police for 13 years. I had good times there and great experience. I worked every division and every detail during that time I was there, and again got some really good experience. And then I kind of got a little, I got to the point where maybe I really should think about getting back in the force. And I come out to depot, or actually out to F Division headquarters, which was at depot, to see about getting back in. And I was amazed at how welcome they made me feel. And I was interviewed by a sergeant by the name of Denny Ling, and he was really encouraging and said, "Well, yeah. So what would you like to do when you get back in?" And I said, "Well, saying that when I get back in?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, "You're going to get back in." He says, "When I recommend it," he says, "they usually accept it." I said, "Well, I'd like to go to Alberta." And he said, "What kind of work would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm working plain clothes in the city." I said, eventually I'd like to get back into plain clothes. So he said Edmonton or Calgary GIS would be okay for you. I says, "Yeah, but that's not going to happen." He says, "Why not?" And when I got back in in the spring of '68, I ended up in Edmonton GIS. And again, great experiences, good cases, and worked auto theft, a lot of commercial auto theft investigations there. And then back down to, I'd gotten involved with police combat shooting when I was in the city police. And so this kind of presented an opportunity. I got to know Ron Wilger, who was in charge of firearms training here. And he said, "Boy," he said, I'd kind of like to have a guy with your experience here," because he said, "I'm getting these guys that got seven years service, and he said they're a little young." He said they're really good, keen guys, but he said I'd like to have somebody with a little longer in the tooth. And so I said, "Oh, man, I'd sure like to get down here." And of course, by this time I'm quite a bit older because of my broken service than the other guys that were coming in. So fortunately, I was able to get down here in '71 as a firearms instructor, and I did that for 3 years. It was a wonderful job, and of course they paid me for doing this job that I that I thought it was really a gift. And back to Edmonton, to NCIS for a couple of years, and then it was a great group of members in GIS in Edmonton, and we're divided up into sections, but occasionally we'd get together for something big that would happen. And I remember a few times we seemed to be involved in a manhunt there every once in a while, and it might just be a guy that escaped from a work gang or something like that, but we'd end up out there looking for these people. And they were some pretty good manhunts there in that bush country out northwest of Edmonton. One time we got word, we come into work on a Monday morning and had a quick meeting, and guys had information that this fellow had come in from Vancouver, and he was staying at the McDonald Hotel, and he was going to case some banks and financial institutions in Alberta, and they wanted to have a tail put on them. So our whole section of about 20 guys, different vehicles and one thing and another, we kind of gathered around the McDonald Hotel, and as soon as he took off from there, well, we put a tail on him, and actually here we are with a string of cars following this fellow, and he's heading out of town. He's heading out towards Drayton Valley, and I remember we did get to Drayton Valley. This is back in that era when plainclothes guys, of course, we all tried to dress pretty sharp. We thought we were real hot shots, I guess, and we were wearing, there was orange shirts and there was gold shirts and there was green shirts and so on and so forth. And so we tried to look a little less conspicuous. We're all wearing suits and ties, of course, and we got out to the country and we were a little noticeable. And so we took off our jackets and tried to conceal our handguns a little bit, and all these multicolored shirts that we were wearing, and the detachment commander, he was just kind of observing what was going on. He knew we were there and what we were doing, and he said, "Man," he said, "I've never seen so many wild-colored shirts in all my life with all you guys." He said, "You were trying to do a stakeout, but," he said, "it was pretty obvious who you were and what you were doing." We followed this guy around. He did do a little casing, and then went back to BC, and some other people, of course, there were on top of him and his buddy, and they ended up. They were going to do one more. They were going to come and make a big trip and take a lot of money out of Alberta, but before they did, they had to collect a little more money in BC. So they did a couple of, or they planned a bank robbery, and they got away, but they ended up getting caught. And the one guy, before he went in, he committed suicide, and the other fellow was arrested. So it was turned out to be, it would have been a big deal had they finished this thing, and they were going to go down in a blaze of glory, like just the information that we had from the intelligence gathered out there. It was kind of exciting at the time, and turned out that it didn't pan out to be what we thought it might be, but it was pretty exciting at the time. During the latter part of the 1800s, the scarlet-coated Mounties and horse patrols became a common sight on the prairies of Western Canada. Picture, if you will, a little homestead somewhere in central Alberta, the late 1890s. A mother and her young son are out in the yard on a warm summer afternoon when the Mountie comes to call. "Ma, what's that red dot out on the plain?" "Well, son, that looks like Sergeant Mills again. He hasn't been around for a month or so, and he'll stay overnight, so you'd better go and catch a rooster and chop off his head, and I'll make up that extra bed. We'll have fried chicken or chicken stew with new potatoes, so dig a few." I ran off and did what my mama said, and she went in to make that bed. He rode into the yard and he said, "Good day." I said, "Howdy, can I put your horse away?" He stepped down and boosted me into the saddle. It was a mighty big horse for me to straddle. I rode that thoroughbred down to the barn and was looking forward to hearing the yarn the Mountie would tell us later that night, how the Scarlet Force maintained the right. Well, I unsaddled the horse and I gave him a drink and threw him some hay as quick as a wink. Then Pa rode in from checking the herd. He was looking forward to hearing the word. Well, we had chicken and dumplings and fried green tomatoes and chicken gravy on those new potatoes. When Ma's rhubarb pie came out of the oven, Bill says, "Ma'am, that smells like heaven." Pa asked the sergeant what was new. He said, "Well, sir, you know that railway's through all the way from Calgary to Edmonton. It's getting mighty civilized, son." Mills winked at me, and then he said, "I got a new poem before you go to bed." He recited a poem about Sergeant Blue. It was really good, and I thought it was true. About that time, my mama said, "You better be getting off to bed," and so I did. But I dreamed all night about how I was going to maintain the right with a Stetson and scarlet coat and all when I grew up to be 6 feet tall. Depot absolutely is a unique place. I think it always has been, and hopefully always will be. I had the really good fortune of coming in here and just enjoying that 3 years instructing and then back later on in charge of the section. But the idea of, I think what it is that you're dealing with these young people who are, and they were younger back then probably than they are now, but they came in here enthusiastic and ready to learn how to be policemen and policewomen, and they were, being in that kind of an atmosphere kind of keeps you with a positive attitude. I found it, you know, it's not the same as being out in the street and working with people that are ne'er-do-wells and criminals and bad eggs all the time. I mean, it's pretty nice to be able to be dealing with young, enthusiastic people who have a great attitude about getting into the force, and I guess that's part of what makes it such a great place to work. But people that are just, they're like a sponge looking for knowledge of, and they want to pick up whatever you can give them in the way of your experience. And I took it as a pretty serious job preparing people to defend themselves with firearms, not only for their own self-defense, but at the same time to not make mistakes with guns. And to me, that was a pretty important part of police work. It wasn't everything, but it was something that they had to know. And I can honestly say that we didn't let anybody out to the field, certainly during my watch at the range, who was not prepared to defend themselves with firearms. And so again, that was a great thing for me, but it wasn't just there. They were learning how to drive cars and learning how to investigate cases and learning the law and learning all these, and human relations. That became such an important part of police work. And when they left here, I really felt confident in the ability of the young people that were graduating from here, that they were ready to do the job out there. So I left here in '88, and certainly it was a great time up till then. And then when I left, I was given the opportunity to be involved with the next step, which was recruit field training. And I went to Edmonton as a recruit interviewer to interview recruits in field training process. And they were, that again was a great time, a lot of traveling, going around to detachments, interviewing these young people again. And that was good until a couple of years later when I took over the section and became the training supervisor and got my staff sergeant's promotion. And I stayed there and enjoyed that job until I retired, and when they kicked me out for being too old in 1994. Part of getting this country together was the promise of a transcontinental railway to link British Columbia and the prairies with eastern Canada. As you travel along the Trans-Canada Highway, which parallels the Canadian Pacific Railway in Western Canada, you encounter some interesting place names like Elkhorn, Indian Head, Moose Jaw, Payapot, Medicine Hat, Maple Creek, just to name a few. There's a story about how one of those towns got its name, and also calls for the recognition of Canadian heroes, which I think is something missing in our culture. Corporal Wilde and the Indian Chief. We're not much for making heroes in this land of ice and snow, but you know, we really had them somewhere Mounties long ago. In the early days of the mounted police in Canada's vast northwest, were men of valor, brave and bold, no doubt Canada's best. I've heard it said, and so have you, they'd never make it today. We're hired more for brain than brawn. This is now the way. But I'll say this and even stand behind a whole month's pay. There's less of a chance to have made it then by the boys and girls of today. Brock Wilde had been a British soldier 7 years before he came to the great Canadian frontier. Now the law would be his game. The force was only 9 years old when he came to don the red. I hope there's some excitement in this new land, he said. So he took his oath of office, swore that he'd maintain the right. By the next year, he'd made corporal. Boys, the future's looking bright. They say he cut a dashing figure, black mustache, 6'2", just the kind of man they wanted when the Scarlet force was new. He rode tall in the saddle. He was brave and he was strong. He was here to do his duty and attempt to right the wrong. Well, it was in the summer of '83, Chief Payapot took his stand. He'd stopped the railway, the CPR, with a camp of his Plains Cree band. He said, if I block the right-of-way, they'll have to pack up and go home, and all the deer and the buffalo will be left for us alone. So he set up his camp where the trail was blazed just east of Maple Creek and wanted to see what the white man would do when he couldn't continue to seek his dreams of the ribbons of steel to go from the east coast to the west. But Payapot hadn't considered encountering Canada's best. Now the railway chiefs, they called the law, the Northwest Mounted Police. We need some help with Payapot. We want him to release the land that he has taken back where the rails were going through. We hope we can get this settled without a real to-do. Well, the Mounted Police didn't want to react and make a great big fuss. So Corporal Wilde said, we'll just go and see, the two of us. I don't suppose the Indians will be more than 100 strong. We'll just go and move them. We won't be very long. When the two redcoats rode to the camp, they found Chief Payapot sitting in front of his teepee considering his lot. He thought he had the white man baffled by his plan, but a bit surprised they'd only sent a corporal and his man. So Wilde said, Chief, you better move. Your camp is in the way. Payapot just grinned and said, well, that'll be the day. So Wilde said, Chief, I'll give you 5 to start to move that tent, and if you don't, I'll kick it down myself, he said, and went and pulled his watch and held it in his hand, and when the 5 minutes were up, he put it back again. He tossed his reins to the constable and jumped down to the ground, and the next thing they all realized, that lodge was coming down. Well, Payapot said, this guy's crazed, or else he's awfully brave. I think we'll move this camp right now while I still can save my face in front of all my Plains Cree Indian band. Because if those redcoats are all that tough, this could be my last stand. But if you wonder who the hero was on that historic day when Payapot decided not to block the right-of-way, you'll notice that the little town that sprung up on that spot is not named after Corporal Wilde, but it is called Payapot. I had a great respect for so many of the good people I worked with. And Depot was such a wonderful place to work, and I was here under Bill McRae as the training officer, just an absolutely wonderful man, probably the best boss I ever had. And Bob McCarricker and other people that were just did a great job in running this place. Great COs. It just, I don't know, it just made you really feel good about what you did. It was a great place. What is the lore and legend of the Northwest Mounted Police? It's many things, but first of all, a dream of Sir John for peace. Peace and calm on the new frontier in 1873 when the force of common and uncommon men really came to be. The lore and legend is a scarlet coat, boots, and a Stetson hat. A gallant-looking figure mounted on a horse of black. It's a motto which interpreted just says maintain the right, and that's exactly what they do come day or black of night. It's what it means to be Canadian when we can swell with pride to the Mountie's regimental march as we watch the musical ride. This police force is romanticized from England to Japan, but from Montana came the saying, they always get their man. It's written on the pages of prose and poetry, the bravery and heroics of common men like you and me. It's the riders of the plains, the Scarlet Force, the Squad of One, Nelson Eddy, Rose Marie, Alan Ladd, Saskatchewan. It's King of the Royal Mounted, written by Zane Grey and Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, who always saved the day. It's the story of the Mountie who met the Indian band, led by the great Chief Sitting Bull, after Custer lost his stand. It's a manhunt o'er the frozen north for a trapper who's gone mad, or a search today for a little child who's wandered from mom and dad. It's the trek of 1874, known as the Great March West, made by 300 brave young men who were worthy of the test. It's Jerry Potts, it's Big Sam Steele, George French, and Jim McLeod. It's the 60,000 member Sints who are every bit